Can you win a nuclear war? The complex history and strategies behind the ultimate question. When the United States created the atomic bomb in 1945, they didn't hesitate to use it to help end the Second World War. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki showcased the immense destructive power of nuclear weapons, leading to Japan's surrender and the end of the conflict. However, the dawn of the nuclear age brought with it a new set of fears and uncertainties, especially as the Cold War emerged. Soviet and American planners now had near-apocalyptic power at their fingertips, but it was difficult to see how they could use it without destroying the world. This led to a fundamental question that has haunted strategists, politicians, and military leaders ever since. Can you win a nuclear war? The beginnings of the nuclear arms race. The development of atomic weapons in the 1940s fundamentally shifted the strategic and military balance between the great powers. In 1945, the United States demonstrated even primitive atomic weapons' destructive potential, forever changing the nature of warfare. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just acts of war, they were also profound demonstrations of power, intended to send a message to the world, particularly the Soviet Union. By 1949, the Soviet Union had successfully tested their own atomic bomb, rebalancing the growing technological and military gulf between the two superpowers. The nuclear arms race was officially underway, with both the US and the USSR rapidly expanding their arsenals. However, with the advent of these new weapons, both sides faced a dilemma. How could they wield such destructive power without triggering mutual annihilation? The moral and strategic dilemmas. From the outset, US President Harry Truman was slow to adopt a formal policy regarding nuclear weapons. For him, the bombs were not just weapons of war, but also political tools, to be used only in the most extreme circumstances. Truman famously reminded his generals that atomic weapons were not traditional military tools. They were designed to wipe out entire populations, including women, children, and unarmed civilians. Despite these reservations, the US continued to build up its stockpiles and developed aircraft capable of delivering them, signaling to the world that it was prepared to use nuclear weapons if necessary. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, initially viewed the bomb with skepticism. In 1946, Stalin suggested that the bomb inspired fear only in those who lacked a strong will. He downplayed its significance, stating that atomic bombs were intended to frighten the weak-nerved, but could not determine the outcome of a war. Stalin's aggressive and obstinate policies following the US bombings of Japan were designed to show the Americans that the Soviet Union would not be intimidated. However, as the Cold War intensified, the strategic landscape changed dramatically. In 1953, both superpowers experienced leadership changes. Dwight Eisenhower replaced Truman as US president, and after Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev emerged as the leader of the Soviet Union. These changes in leadership coincided with significant technological advancements, most notably the development of the hydrogen bomb. The hydrogen bomb and the escalation of destructive power. On November 1st, 1952, the United States detonated the first hydrogen bomb, a thermonuclear weapon that used a fission reaction to trigger the fusion of hydrogen atoms, releasing exponentially more energy than atomic bombs. Hydrogen bombs, often referred to as city killers, could be thousands of times more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Their potential was recognized by global leaders, including UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who remarked that the advent of the hydrogen bomb placed humanity in a situation both measurable and laden with doom. Less than a year later, the Soviets tested their own hydrogen bomb, although it was not yet in a deliverable state. The development of these new weapons opened up a range of possible delivery methods and strategies, further escalating the arms race. Both Khrushchev and Eisenhower were under pressure to reduce military spending, and nuclear weapons appeared to offer a solution. Compared to maintaining massive conventional forces, strategic nuclear weapons could achieve the same military power more cost-effectively. Eisenhower, in particular, faced the challenge of offsetting the Soviet Union's conventional military advantage. With the Soviets maintaining approximately 175 divisions active in Europe at all times, compared to the United States' 20 divisions, only 5 of which were stationed in Europe, Eisenhower concluded that only by threatening to use nuclear weapons could the US promptly stop a major communist aggression. The doctrine of massive retaliation. In October 1953, Eisenhower developed what became known as the New Look policy, publicly stating that he was ready to use nuclear weapons, just like any other munitions. However, his true intention was deterrence. The US adopted a doctrine of massive retaliation, which held that if the Soviets attacked the US or its allies, an overwhelming American nuclear response would make any Soviet gains useless. To ensure the credibility of this strategy, the US developed a diverse array of delivery systems, including submarines and hardened missile silos, ensuring that even if the Soviets struck first, the US could still respond with assured destruction. Eisenhower gambled on the belief that Soviet leaders, despite their ideological differences, were rational actors who did not want to provoke Armageddon. This belief underpinned the policy of deterrence, which became the cornerstone of US nuclear strategy during the Cold War. The Soviet perspective, preemptive strike, and the concept of winning a nuclear war. While the US relied on the threat of massive retaliation to prevent war, the Soviet Union took a different approach. Soviet military doctrine, shaped by the experience of World War II and grounded in Marxist-Leninist principles, viewed war as both a social and political contest. This meant that Soviet military strategy was subordinate to political doctrine, which held that war could be a vehicle for great social change, and that any conflict between capitalist and socialist nations would inevitably result in a socialist victory. With these principles in mind, the idea of an unwinnable war, as envisioned by Eisenhower, was incompatible with Soviet doctrine. However, Soviet political doctrine also stated that only imperialist capitalist states could start wars. This created a strategic dilemma. How could the Soviet Union prepare for nuclear war without being seen as the aggressor? To escape this dilemma, the Soviets concentrated on the concept of a preemptive strike. The idea was that if a US attack appeared imminent, the Soviets would launch their nuclear weapons first, aiming to eliminate enemy military forces, disorganize their rear areas, and suppress the will to resist. This approach required the Soviet Union to maintain permanent strategic nuclear forces that were always on high alert. In 1961, Soviet Minister of Defense Marshal Rodion Malinovsky emphasized the importance of this approach, stating that the most critical task of the armed forces was to be in a constant state of readiness to effectively repulse a surprise attack by the enemy. The Soviet Union's strategic rocket forces, initially relying on strategic bombers like the Tu-20 Bear and M4 Bison, soon shifted focus to intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, as the primary delivery method for their nuclear arsenal. The dangerous paradox of preemptive strike strategies. The Soviet strategy of preemptive strike was inherently dangerous. Miscommunications, misinterpreted intelligence, or technical glitches could all potentially trigger a nuclear exchange. Throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, both the US and the USSR developed nuclear strategies based on overwhelming response and preemption, respectively. However, as new technologies emerged and Cold War tensions escalated, both sides began to realize that their strategies were inflexible and fraught with risk. The early 1960s brought a series of crises that severely tested the resolve and strategies of both superpowers. The 1961 Berlin crisis and the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis pushed both sides uncomfortably close to implementing their war plans, with potentially catastrophic results. Although cooler heads ultimately prevailed, these incidents highlighted the precarious nature of nuclear deterrence and the potential for miscalculation. In response to these crises, US President John F. Kennedy, in coordination with Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, developed the doctrine of flexible response. This strategy included a range of military, political, economic, and nuclear options, allowing Western forces in the NATO alliance to conduct operations without necessarily provoking direct nuclear retaliation by the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact. Nuclear weapons remained on the table, but their use was initially limited to demonstrative purposes or against purely military targets. The evolution of nuclear strategies in the 1970s and 1980s. As the Cold War continued, both the US and the USSR made significant advancements in nuclear technology. By the early 1970s, ICBMs equipped with multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, MIRVs, greatly increased the destructive potential of a single missile. The USSR had also caught up with the US in terms of nuclear stockpiles, and by 1975, the Soviets had 20,000 nuclear warheads compared to the US's 27,000. With this parity, Soviet leaders began to consider the likelihood of a US unprovoked attack as unlikely, rendering their preemptive strike strategies obsolete. Financial pressures also played a role in shifting the focus away from nuclear confrontation. The 1970s saw the beginning of arms limitation discussions, culminating in the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I, in 1972. This treaty allowed both sides to complete the launchers and warheads they were already building, but prohibited the construction of new ones. Despite these efforts, the reality of nuclear war remained a constant concern. The limitations treaties largely applied to intercontinental strategic nuclear weapons aimed at nuclear states, while the non-nuclear states of Europe remained vulnerable. The superpowers still did not fully trust each other, and the possibility of nuclear conflict loomed large. Throughout the 1980s, the idea that nuclear war was unwinnable became increasingly accepted. However, military planners on both sides continued to develop strategies aimed at achieving victory, even if that victory would come at an unimaginable cost. The notion of mutually assured destruction, MAD, provided little flexibility, and the doctrine of flexible response introduced too many unknown variables, increasing the potential for uncontrollable escalation. The close calls of 1983 and the shift toward arms reduction. The year 1983 was particularly tense, bringing two close calls that underscored the dangers of nuclear brinkmanship. In September, the Soviets shot down a Korean air passenger plane that had veered into restricted airspace, heightening tensions. Later that month, a malfunction in the Soviet early warning system falsely indicated that 5 US ICBMs were heading for the Soviet Union. Fortunately, the engineer on duty, Stanislav Petrov, chose not to follow protocol and did not trigger the alarm, preventing what could have been a devastating nuclear exchange. In November 1983, NATO conducted an exercise named Able Archer, simulating a nuclear attack in Western Europe. The Soviets, suspecting that the exercise was a ruse for war, equipped their nuclear forces for imminent retaliation. Thankfully, NATO commanders decided not to respond to Soviet military activity, and the exercise concluded without incident. These events demonstrated that the stability of nuclear deterrence was not always guaranteed, particularly during times of heightened tension. As the Cold War entered its final decade, the realization that deterrence was not foolproof, combined with the growing expense of maintaining large conventional and nuclear forces, led to a further shift in strategy. Under Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union underwent economic and social reforms designed to open Soviet society. These reforms coincided with a renewal of arms limitation agreements, signaling a move away from the confrontational strategies of the past. In 1986, the Chernobyl disaster further highlighted the dangers of nuclear technology and likely accelerated the Soviet Union's eventual demise. The catastrophic consequences of the accident underscored the risks associated with nuclear power, whether for civilian or military use. Just before the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, the US and USSR signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START, the most comprehensive arms reduction agreement to date. The two countries pledged to reduce their stockpiles to 6,000 nuclear warheads each, resulting in the decommissioning of 80% of the world's nuclear weapons by 2001. The legacy of nuclear deterrence and the question of victory. The stability of nuclear deterrence remains a topic of heated debate. Supporters argue that deterrence has prevented another great power war, while critics contend that this benefit is by no means guaranteed in the future, especially as new actors, weapons, and crises emerge. The proliferation of nuclear weapons has increased the complexity of deterrence-based relationships across the globe, raising the risks of miscalculation and escalation. The moral implications of nuclear deterrence have also come under scrutiny. As early as 1962, President Kennedy expressed concerns about the long-term consequences of nuclear weapons, stating that they gamble today's security against the future's survival. This pessimistic view of nuclear weapons suggests that true global security can only be achieved when the world has laid down these weapons, which threaten the very survival of the human race. In the post-Cold War era, new powers have obtained or are close to obtaining nuclear weapons, further complicating the global security landscape. Countries like North Korea and Israel possess nuclear arsenals for coercive power and protection from existential threats. However, this proliferation also increases the risks associated with nuclear deterrence, making the question of whether a future nuclear war can be won all the more pressing. The development of nuclear weapons fundamentally altered the course of history, bringing with it a new set of challenges and dilemmas. While the Cold War ended without a nuclear conflict, the question of whether a nuclear war can be won remains unresolved. The strategies and doctrines developed during the Cold War continue to influence global security policies, but the risks associated with nuclear weapons have only grown as more nations have acquired them. As we look to the future, the question of whether a nuclear war can be won is not just a matter of military strategy, but a moral and existential one. The potential for nuclear conflict remains a stark reminder of the destructive power humanity has harnessed and the responsibility that comes with it. Whether through arms reduction, diplomacy, or a fundamental shift in global security paradigms, the world must continue to grapple with the challenges posed by nuclear weapons in order to ensure that they are never used again.